In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where tradition runs deeper than bloodlines and protocol matters more than personal feelings, a single moment of defiance threatens to shatter centuries of royal decorum. When Prince Alexander stands between his stepmother and the coronation ceremony that will crown his father as supreme monarch, witnesses hold their breath as years of family secrets, political maneuvering, and hidden betrayals come crashing into the open. This isn't just a story about royal drama. It's about the price of power, the weight of duty, and what happens when family loyalty collides with personal justice. Behind the golden gates and marble corridors of Valdoria's Grand Palace, a confrontation is brewing that will determine not just who enters the coronation hall, but who truly belongs in the royal family. Some doors once closed can never be opened again. Some words, once spoken, can never be taken back. And some family wounds run so deep that even a crown cannot heal them. The kingdom watches. The guards hesitate. And in that charged moment, the future of an entire dynasty hangs in the balance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Valdoria's Grand Palace as Lady Evangeline Rosewood stepped from her gilded carriage. Her emerald silk gown rustled against the stone steps, each movement calculated and precise. Today was the day King Reginald would be crowned supreme monarch of the 7 territories, a ceremony that occurred once every generation and marked the highest honor in their realm. Evangeline had married into the royal family 5 years ago, becoming King Reginald's second wife after Queen Isabella's tragic death. She had done everything expected of a royal stepmother: attended state functions, supported charitable causes, and maintained the perfect public image. Yet beneath the polished exterior, tensions had been simmering for years, particularly with Prince Alexander, the king's firstborn son and heir to the throne. As she approached the ceremonial gates leading to the Sacred Hall of Crowns, Evangeline noticed the unusual number of guards stationed around the entrance. Their faces were stern, more serious than typical for royal events. The massive oak doors, carved with centuries-old symbols of Valdorian power, stood partially open, revealing glimpses of the opulent interior where nobles and dignitaries had already begun gathering. Her personal attendant, Marcus, hurried beside her, carrying the ceremonial gifts she would present during the blessing portion of the ceremony.
"Your ladyship," he whispered nervously. "Perhaps we should use the side entrance today."
I noticed Prince Alexander arrived earlier with several of his personal guards. Evangeline's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had spent months preparing for this moment, consulting with palace historians about proper protocol, commissioning the perfect gown from the kingdom's most renowned seamstress, and practicing the ancient blessing words that stepmothers traditionally spoke during coronation ceremonies. She would not be deterred by Alexander's presence or his apparent attempts at intimidation. "The royal family enters through the main gates, Marcus," she replied coolly. "I am the king's wife, and I will not skulk through servant passages on the most important day of his reign." As they reached the ornate entrance, 2 guards stepped forward, their ceremonial halberds crossing to block her path. Behind them, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway. Prince Alexander stood tall in his formal military uniform, decorated with medals earned in the recent territorial conflicts. At 28, he possessed the same strong jawline as his father, but his eyes held a coldness that never seemed to thaw when Evangeline was present.
"Your ladyship,"
Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm afraid there's been a change in today's arrangements." Evangeline felt her heart rate increase, but her expression remained composed. Years of royal training had taught her to never show weakness, especially not in public where curious eyes might be watching. "I'm not aware of any changes, Prince Alexander. The ceremony protocol was finalized weeks ago." "Indeed it was," Alexander replied, stepping closer. The morning light caught the golden threads in his uniform, making him appear almost luminous against the darker stone of the palace walls. "However, new information has come to light that requires adjustments to the guest list." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Evangeline could feel the weight of watching eyes from palace windows above, where courtiers and servants had likely gathered to witness whatever drama was unfolding at the ceremonial gates. This was exactly the kind of public spectacle that could damage her carefully crafted reputation. "What kind of information?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing tension. Alexander exchanged a glance with Captain Dorian, the head of palace security, who had appeared at his side. The captain was a weathered man in his 50s, known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown and his no-nonsense approach to palace affairs. His presence suggested this was more than a simple family disagreement. "Perhaps this conversation would be better conducted in private," Captain Dorian suggested diplomatically, though his hand rested meaningfully on the pommel of his ceremonial sword. No, Evangeline said firmly. If there are accusations being made, I prefer they be stated clearly and openly. I have nothing to hide from the people of Valdoria. Prince Alexander's expression hardened. Very well. 3 days ago, our intelligence network intercepted correspondence between certain members of your former household and agents of the Montclair Rebellion. Communications that suggest a planned disruption of today's ceremony. The accusation hit Evangeline like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing straight. The Montclair Rebellion was a serious matter, a group of displaced nobles who had been attempting to undermine the current royal line for months, claiming that King Reginald's rule was illegitimate due to his marriage outside traditional bloodlines. That's impossible, she replied, though her mind was racing through possibilities. I severed all ties with my previous household when I married the king. I haven't spoken to any of those people in years. Yet the letters were written on paper bearing your personal seal, Alexander continued, his tone growing colder. They detail specific information about today's ceremony that only someone with intimate palace access could know. Information about security arrangements, the timing of ritual elements, even the positioning of the royal family during the crown blessing. Evangeline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Her personal seal had gone missing from her private study several months ago, but she had assumed it had simply been misplaced among her correspondence materials. The possibility that someone had stolen it to forge treasonous documents had never occurred to her. I can explain the missing seal, she began, but Alexander raised his hand to silence her. Can you explain why 3 of your former servants were arrested last night trying to smuggle weapons into the capital? He asked. Can you explain why detailed maps of the palace's ceremonial routes were found in their possession? Maps that included markings indicating the exact locations where my father will be most vulnerable during the procession? The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with nobles and servants alike gathering at a respectful distance to witness the confrontation. Evangeline could hear whispered conversations and could imagine how quickly word of this scene would spread throughout the kingdom. By evening, every tavern and drawing room would be buzzing with rumors about the stepmother who had been barred from her own husband's coronation. These accusations are baseless, Evangeline said, raising her voice slightly so the growing crowd could hear her clearly. I have served this kingdom faithfully since the day I married King Reginald. I have supported every initiative, attended every function, and conducted myself with the dignity befitting my position. The idea that I would betray my husband and my kingdom is not only false, it's insulting. Prince Alexander stepped even closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. 5 years ago, when my father announced his intention to marry you, I told him it was a mistake. I told him that bringing an outsider into our family, especially one with connections to the old noble houses, would eventually lead to problems. He chose to ignore my concerns because he was blinded by his desire to fill the void left by my mother's death. The mention of Queen Isabella sent a fresh wave of pain through Evangeline's chest. She had lived in the shadow of the beloved former queen since the day she arrived at the palace, constantly compared to a woman she could never replace in the people's hearts or in Alexander's affections. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Evangeline replied quietly. I never tried to replace her. I only tried to serve the kingdom as best I could. By plotting with rebels who want to see my family destroyed? Alexander's voice was sharp with anger. By providing them with intelligence that could have been used to assassinate my father during the most sacred ceremony of his reign? I never provided anyone with anything, Evangeline insisted. If my seal was used, it was without my knowledge or consent. If my former servants have been arrested, it's news to me. I came here today as I come to every royal function to fulfill my duties as queen consort and to support my husband. Captain Dorian stepped forward, his expression grave. Cute! Your ladyship, given the seriousness of these allegations and the ongoing investigation, I'm afraid I cannot permit you to enter the sacred hall until this matter is resolved.
The security of the ceremony and the safety of the royal family must take precedence.
The finality in his voice made it clear this was not a request or suggestion. It was an order backed by the full authority of the crown. Evangeline looked past him toward the doorway where she could see glimpses of the magnificent ceremony space, decorated with centuries of royal regalia and filled with the most important people in the kingdom. Does the king know about this? She asked, grasping for any remaining hope that this nightmare could be resolved. Alexander's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the pain beneath his anger. My father is in the final stages of ceremonial preparation. The last thing he needs on the most important day of his reign is to be distracted by family drama and security concerns. The decision to exclude you from the ceremony was made to protect him and to protect the integrity of the coronation itself.
You made this decision without consulting him. Evangeline felt a surge of anger breaking through her careful composure.
You took it upon yourself to bar his wife from the most significant event of his life? I made the decision that needed to be made, Alexander replied firmly. As future king, it's my responsibility to protect this family and this kingdom, even when it means making difficult choices. The weight of her situation settled fully upon Evangeline as she stood before the closed gates of the ceremony she had helped plan for months. Her husband was inside, preparing for his greatest triumph, unaware that his wife had been publicly accused of treason and barred from sharing the moment with him. The nobles and courtiers who had smiled at her face for years were now watching her humiliation with barely concealed satisfaction. Marcus stepped closer to her side, his loyalty evident despite the dangerous circumstances. "What are your orders, your ladyship?" Evangeline straightened her shoulders and adjusted her gloves, calling upon every lesson in royal deportment she had ever learned. If she was going to be publicly disgraced, she would face it with dignity.
"Captain Dorian," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I will comply with your orders, but I want it noted that I am doing so under protest, and with the full intention of clearing my name.
When these false accusations are proven wrong, as they will be, I expect a full public apology and acknowledgement of the damage done to my reputation today." "Noted, your ladyship," Captain Dorian replied formally. She turned to face Prince Alexander one final time. "You may have succeeded in removing me from today's ceremony, but you have not removed me from this family or from my position as queen consort. I will fight these accusations with every resource at my disposal, and when the truth comes to light, you will have to answer for the way you've handled this situation." Alexander's expression remained unmoved. "I look forward to that conversation, stepmother. In the meantime, I suggest you use this time to consider how your actions may have inadvertently aided those who wish harm to our family." With that, he turned and walked back through the ceremonial gates, which closed with a resounding clang behind him. The guards remained in position, their message clear. Lady Evangeline Rosewood, Queen Consort of Valdoria, was not welcome at her husband's coronation. As she walked back toward her carriage, Evangeline could feel the eyes of the kingdom upon her. The whispered conversations and sideways glances would follow her for days, weeks, perhaps months to come. But beneath her humiliation and anger, a determination was growing. Someone had orchestrated this elaborate frame, someone with access to her private possessions and detailed knowledge of her background. She would find out who was behind these accusations, and she would make them pay for what they had stolen from her today. The silence in Evangeline's private chambers was deafening as she sat before her vanity mirror, still wearing the emerald gown she had chosen so carefully for the coronation ceremony. Through her windows, she could hear the distant sounds of celebration echoing from the palace's ceremonial grounds. Trumpets announcing her husband's ascension to supreme monarch, cheers from gathered crowds, and the triumphant music that should have included her voice among the royal blessing choir. Marcus had dismissed the other servants and stood quietly near the door, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by worried concern. He had served Evangeline since her arrival at the palace 5 years ago, and had witnessed every struggle she had faced trying to establish herself in a court that remained loyal to Queen Isabella's memory. "Your ladyship," he ventured carefully, "perhaps we should send word to Lord Chancellor Morrison. He has always been fair in his dealings with you, and his influence with the king could help resolve this matter." Evangeline stared at her reflection, noting how the morning's events had aged her face. At 34, she had always prided herself on maintaining the grace and poise expected of royalty, but today she looked every one of her years and more. The carefully applied cosmetics could not hide the strain around her eyes or the tension in her jaw. "Morrison won't help," she replied quietly. "He's a practical man who serves the crown above all else. Until these accusations are proven false, he'll distance himself from me to protect his own position." She stood and began removing the elaborate jewelry she had worn for the ceremony, emerald earrings that had belonged to King Reginald's grandmother, a diamond necklace that was a wedding gift from the people of Valdoria, and the golden circlet that marked her rank as queen consort. Each piece felt heavier than usual as she set them aside. "Then what shall we do?" Marcus asked. "Surely we cannot simply wait for others to investigate these claims. Your reputation, your marriage, your very safety may depend on proving your innocence quickly." Evangeline turned from the mirror to face him. In his 50s, Marcus had served 3 different noble houses before coming to the palace, and his experience with court intrigue was valuable. More importantly, he was one of the few people she trusted completely. You're right, she said, moving to her writing desk. If Prince Alexander wants to play political games, I'll show him that I learned how to navigate court politics long before I arrived in Valdoria. She pulled out a sheet of her personal stationery and began writing quickly. I want you to arrange discreet meetings with 3 people, Lady Catherine Blackwood, Sir Edmund Thorne, and, surprisingly enough, Duchess Victoria Montclair. Marcus raised his eyebrows at the last name. Your ladyship, the Duchess is the sister of the rebel leader. Meeting with her could be seen as further evidence of your alleged connections to the rebellion. Exactly why she might be willing to talk, Evangeline explained as she continued writing. If someone is using the Montclair name to frame me, she would have every reason to want the real conspirators exposed. Her family's reputation is at stake just as much as mine. As she sealed the first letter, a soft knock came at the chamber door. Marcus moved to answer it, speaking in hushed tones with whoever stood outside. When he returned, his expression was grave. A message from the king, he said, holding out a royal courier's pouch, delivered with instructions that it be given to you immediately. Evangeline's heart leaped as she broke the royal seal. Perhaps Reginald had learned of the morning's events and was demanding answers. Perhaps he was summoning her to the ceremony after all. But as she read the brief message, her hopes crumbled. My dear Evangeline, I have been informed of serious concerns regarding your safety and potential threats to the crown. For your own protection and the security of the realm, I must ask that you remain in your chambers until these matters can be properly investigated. I regret that circumstances prevent you from attending today's ceremony, but I trust you understand that the crown's security must take precedence. I will speak with you tomorrow when the celebrations have concluded. Your devoted husband, Reginald. The formal tone and careful wording told Evangeline everything she needed to know. This was not a message from a concerned husband. It was an official royal decree, likely written by palace advisors and signed by a king who was being carefully managed by his son and council.
He doesn't know, she whispered, sinking into her chair.
They've isolated him from the truth and are controlling what information he receives. Marcus read the message over her shoulder. This sounds like house arrest, your ladyship. If you're confined to your chambers, how can you conduct the investigation needed to clear your name? Before Evangeline could answer, another knock came at the door. This time, Marcus returned with a worried expression and a small, folded piece of paper that bore no official seals or identifying marks. This was slipped under the door, he explained. The messenger was gone by the time I opened it. Evangeline unfolded the paper and read the brief message written in an elegant feminine hand. If you truly wish to know who orchestrated your downfall, meet me in the rose garden at midnight. Come alone and bring the emerald brooch your husband gave you on your wedding day. You have more allies than you know, but trust the wrong person and you will lose everything. The note was unsigned, but something about the handwriting seemed familiar, though Evangeline couldn't immediately place it. She read it twice more, weighing the risks against her desperate need for answers. This could be a trap, Marcus warned, having read the message as well. Someone luring you out of the safety of your chambers to harm you or gather more evidence against you. Or it could be genuine help from someone who knows the truth, Evangeline countered. At this point, what do I have to lose? My reputation is already in ruins. My husband has been turned against me, and I'm essentially a prisoner in my own home. She moved to her jewelry box and retrieved the emerald brooch mentioned in the note, exquisite piece featuring the intertwined emblems of her family house and the royal line, designed specifically for her wedding day. Why this particular piece was mentioned she couldn't imagine, but she had learned to pay attention to such details in court intrigue. As afternoon faded into evening, Evangeline found herself listening to the continuing celebration sounds from the ceremonial halls below. Guests would be enjoying the coronation feast now, toasting her husband's new status and discussing the day's events. No doubt her absence had become a major topic of conversation, with various theories and rumors circulating about why the queen consort had been notably missing from the ceremony. Marcus brought her a simple dinner, but she found she had little appetite. Instead, she spent the time reviewing everything she could remember about the past few months, searching for clues about who might have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The missing seal, the forged letters, the arrested servants, it all required careful planning and inside knowledge of palace operations. As she pondered, certain memories began to surface. 3 months ago, she had noticed that several items in her private study had been rearranged, though nothing seemed to be missing at the time. 6 weeks ago, Prince Alexander had asked unusually detailed questions about her correspondence habits during a family dinner, questions she had dismissed as polite conversation. 2 weeks ago, Captain Dorian had requested updated guest lists for the coronation, including specific notes about which nobles had connections to other royal houses. Each incident had seemed innocent at the time, but viewed together, they suggested a pattern of investigation that had been building for months. Someone had been carefully gathering information and laying groundwork for today's accusations. The hours crawled by until finally, near midnight, Evangeline wrapped herself in a dark cloak and prepared to leave her chambers. Marcus tried one final time to dissuade her, but she was determined to follow the mysterious invitation. "If I'm not back within 2 hours, alert Lord Chancellor Morrison," she instructed. "Tell him everything we know and demand a full investigation." The palace corridors were dimly lit at this hour, with only occasional guards patrolling the main routes. Evangeline knew the building well enough to navigate the less-traveled passages that would lead her to the Rose Garden without being seen. The garden was located in the oldest part of the palace grounds, surrounded by high walls and accessible through several discreet entrances. As she stepped into the moonlit garden, the scent of blooming roses filled the night air. The formal flower beds and carefully maintained pathways created a maze of shadows and silvery patches of moonlight. Evangeline made her way to the central fountain, where a figure was already waiting. To her surprise, the person who stepped forward was someone she recognized but would never have expected: Lady Margaret Ashford, Prince Alexander's former fiancée and one of the most influential young women in the kingdom. Margaret had been expected to marry the prince until she suddenly ended their engagement 2 years ago, citing personal reasons that were never fully explained. "Lady Evangeline," Margaret said, her voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would trust the invitation." "Lady Margaret," Evangelica replied carefully, "I must admit you were not who I expected to find here. What do you know about the accusations made against me today?" Margaret glanced around the garden, ensuring they were alone before speaking. "I know they're false, and I know who's behind them. But before I explain, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you will put both our lives in danger." She moved closer, her young face serious in the moonlight. "The conspiracy against you goes deeper than you realize, and it involves people you trust. Prince Alexander isn't the mastermind behind your downfall. He's being manipulated by someone who wants to destroy both you and him." Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What do you mean? 2 years ago, when I broke my engagement to Alexander, it wasn't because of any problem between us," Margaret explained. "I discovered that someone in his inner circle was feeding information to foreign agents. Information that could compromise Valdorian security. When I tried to tell Alexander about my suspicions, I realized the person I suspected was someone he trusted completely." "Who?" Evangeline demanded. Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. "Captain Dorian, the man who barred you from the ceremony this morning, the man who claims to be investigating threats against the crown, is the same man who has been selling palace secrets to neighboring kingdoms for the past 3 years." The revelation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Captain Dorian had been with the royal family for over a decade, had served under both Queen Isabella and King Reginald with apparent loyalty, and was trusted with the highest levels of palace security. "That's impossible," Evangeline whispered. "He has access to everything: security arrangements, family schedules, state secrets. If he's been compromised, then every decision made in the past 3 years based on his advice has potentially been influenced by foreign interests." Margaret finished, "including today's accusations against you." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small leather portfolio. "These are copies of documents I've been gathering for months. Financial records showing unexplained payments to Dorian, correspondence that suggests he's been working with agents from the Kingdom of Astoria, and most importantly, evidence that he orchestrated the theft of your personal seal and arranged for the forged letters." Evangeline took the portfolio with shaking hands. "Why didn't you take this to Prince Alexander directly? Why approach me in secret?" Margaret's expression grew sad. "Because Alexander has been influenced by Dorian for years. Every piece of advice about security, every suggestion about potential threats, every recommendation about who to trust or distrust has come from a man who is working for enemy interests. Alexander genuinely believes he's protecting the kingdom by acting against you, but he's actually furthering Dorian's plans." "What plans?" Evangeline asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "To destabilize the royal family from within," Margaret explained. "By turning the prince against his stepmother, by creating suspicion and discord in the family, by making the kingdom question the legitimacy of the royal line. Today's accusations against you are just the beginning. If Dorian's plans succeed, the Valdorian monarchy will tear itself apart, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to foreign influence or conquest. Evangeline clutched the emerald brooch in her free hand, finally understanding why the mysterious note had requested she bring it.
You needed to be sure I was really the queen consort before revealing this information.
Exactly. This brooch was crafted by royal jewelers and contains specific markings that cannot be forged.
I had to be certain you were who you claimed to be and not some agent sent to test my loyalty. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Evangeline felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. Clearing her name would require exposing Captain Dorian's treason, which would mean revealing that the kingdom's security had been compromised for years. It would also mean proving to Prince Alexander that his trusted advisor had been manipulating him, a revelation that could shatter his confidence in his own judgment.
"What do you propose we do?" she asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since the conversation began.
"We're going to give Captain Dorian enough rope to hang himself, but it will require you to play a very dangerous game, one where a single mistake could cost both of us our lives."
The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Evangeline's chambers. She had barely finished her morning correspondence when Marcus announced that Prince Alexander himself was requesting an audience. Given the previous day's confrontation, this development was both surprising and potentially significant. "Show him in," Evangeline decided, quickly reviewing the plan she and Lady Margaret had developed during their midnight meeting. Everything would depend on her ability to play her role convincingly while gathering the evidence they needed to expose Captain Dorian's treachery. Prince Alexander entered with his usual formal bearing, but Evangeline noticed subtle signs of fatigue around his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that suggested he had not slept well. The coronation celebrations had continued late into the night, and she suspected the weight of his accusations against her was beginning to trouble him. "Your ladyship," he said with a slight bow, maintaining the courtesy due to her rank despite their personal conflict. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Prince Alexander," she replied, gesturing to one of the elegant chairs near her sitting area. "I assume this visit concerns yesterday's unfortunate events?" Alexander sat down, his military uniform pristine despite the early hour. "It does. I want you to know that the investigation into the allegations against you is proceeding with all due diligence. Captain Dorian has assured me that we will have answers within a few days." Evangeline felt a surge of anger at hearing Dorian's name, but she forced herself to maintain a composed expression. "According to Margaret's intelligence, Dorian would likely be working to manufacture additional evidence against her while destroying any traces of his own guilt. I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation," she said carefully. "However, I remain concerned about the damage being done to my reputation while these false accusations remain unresolved. The entire kingdom now believes their queen consort is a traitor." "That's partially why I'm here," Alexander admitted, his tone softening slightly. "My father, the king, has been asking questions about your absence from the ceremony. He's not entirely satisfied with the explanations he's been given." This was unexpected news, and Evangeline felt a spark of hope. "Is he requesting to speak with me?" "He wanted to, but Captain Dorian advised against it until the investigation is complete. He's concerned that any private conversations between you and the king could compromise the integrity of the evidence-gathering process." Evangeline recognized this as exactly the kind of manipulation Margaret had warned her about. Dorian was systematically isolating her from potential allies while positioning himself as the ultimate authority on the situation. "Prince Alexander," she said, choosing her words very carefully, "I understand your loyalty to Captain Dorian. He served your family faithfully for many years and you trust his judgment. But have you considered the possibility that someone with access to palace security might be using that access for purposes other than protecting the crown?" Alexander's expression hardened immediately. "Are you suggesting that Captain Dorian is involved in this conspiracy? The man who discovered the evidence against you in the first place? I'm suggesting that the person who discovered evidence might be the same person who created it," Evangeline replied calmly. "Consider the timing. Captain Dorian claims to have intercepted correspondence just days before the coronation. Correspondence that conveniently provides exactly the justification needed to remove me from the ceremony. Doesn't that seem remarkably convenient?" "Convenient timing doesn't invalidate evidence," Alexander countered, but she could see doubt flickering in his eyes. "The letters bear your seal, the arrested servants were from your former household, and the intelligence about palace security was accurate. How do you explain those facts?" This was the moment Evangeline had been preparing for.
She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out one of the documents Margaret had provided, a financial record showing suspicious payments to Captain Dorian. "I can't explain the evidence against me," she said, "but I can show you evidence of something else entirely."
"Are you familiar with Captain Dorian's personal financial situation?" Alexander took the document and studied it, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read. The record showed regular payments from an Astorian trading company, known to be a front for that kingdom's intelligence operations.
"Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "From someone who has been conducting their own investigation into palace security," Evangeline replied. "Someone who discovered irregularities months ago, but wasn't sure who to trust with the information." She pulled out additional documents from Margaret's portfolio. Correspondence that suggested coordination between Dorian and foreign agents, records of information being shared that should have remained classified, and most damning of all, a letter in Dorian's handwriting discussing plans to eliminate threats to our arrangement.
Alexander studied each document carefully, his face growing paler with each revelation. This suggests that Captain Dorian has been compromised for years.
If this is accurate, then every security recommendation he's made, every investigation he's conducted, and every threat assessment he's provided has potentially been influenced by foreign interests, Evangeline finished, including his assessment of the threat I supposedly posed to the crown. The prince set the documents aside and rubbed his temples, the weight of the implications clearly overwhelming him. If Dorian has been feeding information to Astoria, they would know our defensive capabilities, our diplomatic strategies, even our succession planning. The damage to kingdom security could be catastrophic. "Which is why we need to handle this situation very carefully," Evangeline said. "If Dorian suspects we're onto him, he could destroy evidence, flee the kingdom, or worse, accelerate whatever plans he has in motion." Alexander looked up at her sharply.
"What do you mean, we? If these allegations against you are part of Dorian's deception, then you're a victim in this situation, not an investigator. A victim who has been framed for treason and publicly humiliated." Evangeline replied with steel in her voice. "I have every right to seek justice and clear my name. More importantly, I may be the only person in position to gather the evidence needed to prove Dorian's guilt without arousing his suspicions." She leaned forward, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. "Think about it. Dorian believes his plan is working perfectly. He thinks I'm helpless and isolated, that you and the king have completely turned against me. He won't be expecting me to fight back or investigate him. That gives us an advantage we can't afford to waste." Alexander stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. "What kind of plan are you proposing?" "I need you to continue treating me as a suspected traitor," Evangeline explained. "Maintain the restrictions on my movements, keep me isolated from the king, and let Dorian believe his manipulation of you is succeeding. Meanwhile, I'll work to gather additional evidence of his real activities." "That's incredibly dangerous," Alexander pointed out. "If Dorian realizes what you're doing, then I'll face the same fate as anyone else who has threatened his operations," Evangeline acknowledged. "But if we don't stop him, the damage to the kingdom could be irreversible." The prince stopped pacing and looked at her with new respect. "You're willing to risk your life to protect a kingdom that just yesterday branded you a traitor." "This is my kingdom too," Evangeline replied simply. "I may not have been born here, but I chose to make Valdoria my home when I married your father. I won't stand by and watch it be destroyed from within." Alexander was quiet for several minutes, weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Access to palace records that only royal family members can request," she said. "Financial documents, correspondence logs, security reports, anything that might reveal patterns in Dorian's activities. Also, I need you to arrange for me to meet with some of the servants who were supposedly arrested in connection with my case. I suspect they were framed just as thoroughly as I was." "I can arrange the records access," Alexander agreed. "But meeting with the arrested servants will be more difficult. Dorian has them confined in the lower dungeons, and access is strictly controlled. Then we'll need to be creative about creating opportunities," Evangeline said. "Perhaps a visit from the Queen Consort to assess the conditions of palace prisoners? A routine inspection that just happens to include questioning about their alleged crimes?" Alexander smiled grimly. "You're more devious than I gave you credit for, stepmother." "I learned from the best," she replied. "Your mother was known for her ability to navigate court politics when necessary. I may not be Queen Isabella, but I can be just as cunning when my family and kingdom are threatened." As Alexander prepared to leave, he turned back to face her. "Evangeline, I owe you an apology for yesterday.
I genuinely believed I was protecting the kingdom and my father. If these suspicions about Dorian are correct, then I've been manipulated into attacking an innocent person. Apologies can wait until we've solved this crisis, she replied. Right now, we need to focus on exposing the truth before Dorian can do any more damage. After Alexander departed, Evangeline immediately began planning her next moves. The documents Margaret had provided were valuable, but they would need much more evidence to convince King Reginald and the palace council that his trusted security chief was actually a foreign agent. Marcus returned from his morning errands with interesting intelligence of his own. Your ladyship, I made discreet inquiries with some of the kitchen staff and learned something curious. Captain Dorian has been holding private meetings in his office late at night, meetings that don't appear on any official schedule. The cleaning staff has noticed that his office shows signs of having been occupied well past normal hours. Interesting, Evangeline mused. I wonder what kind of business requires such secrecy. There's more, Marcus continued. One of the stable hands mentioned seeing Captain Dorian meeting with a well-dressed stranger near the outer gates several nights ago. The stranger was riding a horse with Astorian markings. This information confirmed Margaret's intelligence about Dorian's foreign connections. Now, they needed to catch him in the act of his treasonous activities. Marcus, I need you to begin watching Captain Dorian's movements, she instructed. Be very careful not to be noticed, but track his schedule, his visitors, and especially any activities that seem unusual or secretive. I'll be discreet, your ladyship, Marcus promised. What will you be doing? Evangeline moved to her wardrobe and began selecting a more practical outfit than her usual formal attire. I'm going to pay a visit to the palace archives. If Dorian has been conducting unauthorized activities for years, there should be records that don't quite add up. Discrepancies in security reports, gaps in correspondence logs, inconsistencies in financial accounting. As she prepared for what could be the most dangerous investigation of her life, Evangeline reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a queen consort preparing for her husband's greatest triumph. Today, she was an accused traitor, working secretly to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of palace security. The irony wasn't lost on her that proving her innocence would require engaging in exactly the kind of secretive, potentially treasonous activities she had been accused of committing. But sometimes protecting the crown required working outside official channels, especially when those channels had been compromised. One way or another, she would uncover the truth about Captain Dorian's real agenda. The survival of the Valdorian monarchy might depend on it. 3 days into her covert investigation, Evangeline had assembled a troubling picture of Captain Dorian's activities. The palace archives, accessible through Prince Alexander's authorization, revealed a pattern of small but significant irregularities dating back nearly 4 years. Financial discrepancies in security department budgets, gaps in correspondence logs during crucial diplomatic periods, and security reports that had been amended without proper documentation. She was studying these documents in her private chambers when Marcus burst in with urgent news. Your ladyship, we have a problem, he said, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious alarm. I followed Captain Dorian to his late-night meeting as you requested, but what I discovered is far worse than we suspected. Evangeline set aside the financial records she had been reviewing. What did you see? He met with 3 people in the abandoned watchtower near the eastern wall, Marcus explained quickly. One was definitely Astorian. I recognized the accent from my years of service in the borderlands. But the other 2 were palace staff members. Lady Catherine Blackwood's personal secretary and one of the kitchen supervisors who has access to the royal family's meal schedules. The implications hit Evangeline immediately. He's not just selling information. He's running an entire spy network inside the palace. People we see every day, people who serve the royal family directly, are working for foreign interests. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. I couldn't get close enough to hear everything, but I caught fragments of conversation about the final phase and eliminating remaining obstacles. Your ladyship, I believe they're planning something immediate and dangerous. Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine. If Dorian was accelerating his plans, it could mean he suspected their investigation, or had received orders from his Astorian handlers to take decisive action. We need to warn Prince Alexander immediately, she decided, rising from her chair. Whatever Dorian is planning, we can't wait for more evidence to stop it. But before she could reach the door, it opened to admit an unexpected visitor. King Reginald himself stepped into her chambers, his expression grave and tired. Behind him stood 2 royal guards, but notably absent was Captain Dorian, who typically accompanied the king on all movements through the palace.
Your Majesty, Evangeline said, immediately dropping into a respectful curtsy despite her shock at his sudden appearance.
Evangeline, Reginald replied, his voice carrying a weariness that made him seem older than his 53 years. I believe it's time we had a conversation about the accusations that have been made against you. The king's presence filled the room with an authority that reminded Evangeline why she had fallen in love with him 5 years ago. Even tired and troubled, Reginald possessed the kind of natural dignity that made him a respected leader. His dark hair was now touched with silver at the temples, and the weight of kingship showed in the lines around his eyes, but he remained an imposing figure.
I've been hoping for the chance to speak with you, Evangeline replied carefully, aware that Marcus was discreetly withdrawing to give them privacy. The accusations against me are false, but I understand why they must be taken seriously.
Alexander briefed me on some troubling information he's discovered, Reginald said, moving to sit in one of her chairs. Evidence suggesting that someone has been manipulating the security apparatus of this palace for their own purposes. Evangeline felt a surge of relief that Alexander had shared their findings with his father, but she remained cautious.
The king's visit could be genuine, or it could be part of Dorian's expanding web of deception. What kind of evidence? She asked, settling into the chair across from him.
Reginald pulled out a leather portfolio similar to the one Margaret had provided. Financial records showing irregular payments, correspondence that suggests coordination with foreign agents, and most concerning of all, evidence that several palace staff members may be compromised. He opened the portfolio and showed her documents she hadn't seen before. More recent correspondence that revealed the scope of Dorian's network was even larger than they had suspected. Names of nobles, servants, and even some minor court officials appeared on lists of people receiving payments or providing information.
Where did you obtain these documents? Evangeline asked, studying the new information.
From sources I cannot reveal without potentially endangering their lives, Reginald replied cryptically.
But I can tell you that the investigation into Captain Dorian's activities has been ongoing for several weeks, completely separate from the accusations made against you.
This revelation stunned Evangeline.
You've known about Dorian's potential treason for weeks. We've suspected it, Reginald corrected. But suspicion and proof are different things, especially when dealing with someone who has been trusted with our most sensitive security matters. We needed to be absolutely certain before taking action. We? Evangeline asked. A very small group of people who have been conducting a careful investigation, the king explained. Lord Chancellor Morrison, Prince Alexander, myself, and one other person whose identity must remain protected. Evangeline realized with growing understanding that she had been caught up in a much larger operation. The accusations against me, were they part of this investigation? Reginald's expression grew pained. I'm afraid so. We needed to create a situation that would make Dorian believe his manipulation of palace security was succeeding. By allowing him to think he had successfully turned the royal family against you, we hoped he would become careless and reveal the full extent of his network. The king reached across to take her hand, his touch warm and familiar. I am deeply sorry for the pain and humiliation you've endured, my dear. It was never our intention for the deception to go so far, but Dorian's reactions suggested we were on to something significant. Evangeline felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that her husband had never truly believed the accusations against her, anger that she had been used as an unwitting tool in the investigation, and fear about what Dorian might do if he discovered the truth. Does Dorian know you suspect him? She asked. We believe he's beginning to realize that the investigation isn't proceeding as he planned, Reginald admitted, which is why we need to move quickly to complete our evidence gathering and make arrests before he can escape or destroy crucial information. As if summoned by their conversation, rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor outside Evangeline's chambers. Prince Alexander burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency and his usual composed demeanor completely abandoned. Father, we have a crisis, he announced without preamble. Captain Dorian has discovered our investigation. He's moving to activate whatever endgame he had planned. Reginald stood immediately, his kingly authority taking precedence over personal concerns. What happened? One of our surveillance operatives was discovered and captured, Alexander explained rapidly. Before they could be silenced, they managed to get word to us that Dorian is planning something for tonight's state dinner. Something involving the Astorian ambassador and several compromised palace staff members. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face. The monthly state dinner was a formal gathering of all the kingdom's most important nobles, foreign diplomats, and palace officials. If Dorian was planning some kind of action during such an event, the potential for catastrophe was enormous. What kind of action?
Reginald demanded.
We don't know for certain, Alexander admitted, but our intelligence suggests it could be anything from a coordinated intelligence-gathering operation to something as extreme as an assassination attempt or coup. The king began pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities and countermeasures.
How many people does Dorian have in his network?
Based on the documents we've gathered and today's intelligence, at least a dozen palace staff members, 3 minor nobles, and possibly some of the foreign diplomatic staff, Alexander replied. Enough people to coordinate a significant disruption of palace operations. Evangeline stood, her own mind racing through the implications. The state dinner would be the perfect opportunity for maximum impact. All of Valdoria's leadership gathered in one place, foreign diplomats present to witness whatever happens, and enough chaos to mask escape routes or destroy evidence. Exactly, Reginald agreed grimly. The question is whether we cancel the dinner and risk alerting Dorian that we know about his plans, or proceed with the event and try to counter whatever he's planning.
There's a third option, Evangeline suggested, drawing surprised looks from both men. We use tonight's dinner to catch Dorian and his network in the act.
Turn his own trap against him. Alexander shook his head. That's incredibly risky.
If something goes wrong, we could lose half the kingdom's leadership in a single evening. And if we don't stop him tonight, he'll disappear and continue working against the kingdom from the shadows, Evangeline countered.
At least this way we have some control over the situation. King Reginald studied his wife with new appreciation. What did you have in mind? We proceed with the dinner as planned, but with some modifications, Evangeline explained, her mind working through the details as she spoke.
We position loyal guards throughout the dining hall in disguise. We prepare contingency plans for various scenarios, and we use the event to gather evidence of Dorian's network in action. Most importantly, she continued, we give Dorian a target he can't resist, me. If he's been orchestrating this entire conspiracy to destabilize the royal family, he'll want to complete his destruction of the queen consort in the most public way possible. The room fell silent as the two men considered her proposal. Finally, Prince Alexander spoke. You're talking about using yourself as bait in a trap that could get you killed. I'm talking about ending this threat to the kingdom once and for all. Evangeline replied firmly. Dorian has already destroyed my reputation and tried to turn my family against me. I won't let him have the chance to do worse. Reginald looked at his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. If we do this, you'll be in constant danger throughout the evening. One mistake, one overlooked detail, and Dorian could succeed in whatever he's planning. Then we'll have to make sure there are no mistakes, Evangeline said with more confidence than she felt. Besides, I have advantages Dorian doesn't know about. He thinks I'm isolated and helpless, but I actually have allies he's never suspected. She thought of Lady Margaret and the intelligence network they had been building, of Marcus and his careful surveillance, of the growing evidence they had gathered. For the first time since this crisis began, Evangeline felt like they might actually have a chance to win. Very well, King Reginald decided. We'll proceed with the state dinner, but with extensive security modifications and contingency planning. Alexander, I want you to coordinate with the guards you trust completely. No one who might be part of Dorian's network. Evangeline, I want you to brief us on everything you've learned during your own investigation. As they began planning what could be the most dangerous evening of their lives, Evangeline reflected on how much had changed since the coronation ceremony just days ago. She had gone from accused traitor to potential savior of the kingdom, but the final test was still ahead. Tonight, at the state dinner, the fate of Valdoria would be decided. The grand dining hall had never looked more magnificent than it did on this fateful evening. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with the finest china and silver, while tapestries bearing the ancient arms of Valdoria adorned the walls. To any observer, it appeared to be a perfectly normal state dinner, but Evangeline could feel the tension crackling beneath the surface as nobles, diplomats, and palace officials took their assigned seats. She had spent hours preparing for this evening, both in terms of her appearance and her strategy. The gown she wore was a deep sapphire blue that complemented the royal jewels, but more importantly, it was designed to allow freedom of movement if circumstances required it. Hidden beneath the elegant facade, she wore a thin chainmail vest that Prince Alexander had provided, and a small dagger was concealed in a specially designed pocket in her skirt. As she entered the dining hall on King Reginald's arm, Evangeline scanned the assembled guests for familiar faces. The Astorian ambassador was present, as expected, seated at a place of honor near the royal table. She recognized several of the palace staff members that Marcus had identified as part of Dorian's network, all serving in their usual roles, but with an alertness that suggested they were awaiting some predetermined signal. Captain Dorian himself stood near the main entrance, overseeing security arrangements with his typical professional demeanor. To anyone watching, he appeared to be simply fulfilling his duties, but Evangeline noticed the way his eyes tracked her movement through the room and the subtle hand signals he exchanged with certain staff members. "He knows something is different," she murmured to Reginald as they took their seats at the high table. "Our people are in position," the king replied quietly. "Whatever he's planning, we're as ready as we can be." Prince Alexander sat to Evangeline's left, his military bearing disguising the fact that he was armed and prepared for combat. Scattered throughout the hall, disguised as servants and minor nobles, were 24 of the kingdom's most trusted guards, all briefed on the various contingency plans they had developed. The dinner proceeded normally through the first 2 courses, with polite conversation about trade agreements, weather patterns, and other diplomatic pleasantries. But Evangeline noticed that the Asturian ambassador kept checking a pocket watch, and several of Dorian's suspected collaborators seemed unusually nervous. As the 3rd course was being served, Lady Margaret Ashford approached the high table with a concerned expression. She had been assigned the role of monitoring communications between the suspected conspirators, using her social connections to move freely through the gathering. "Your Majesties," she said with a respectful bow, "I've observed some unusual activity among the serving staff. Several people have left their assigned positions and appear to be gathering near the kitchen entrances." This was the signal they had been waiting for. Evangeline felt her heart rate increase as she realized Dorian's plan was beginning to unfold. King Reginald nodded slightly to Prince Alexander, who discreetly signaled to their position guards. Whatever was about to happen, they were as prepared as possible. The crisis began suddenly and from an unexpected direction. Instead of an obvious attack, Captain Dorian stepped forward and loudly requested the attention of all gathered guests. "Your Majesties, honored guests," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I regret to interrupt this pleasant evening, but urgent security matters require immediate attention." The conversation in the hall died away as all eyes turned to the captain. Evangeline felt a cold dread settling in her stomach as she realized he was about to make some kind of public accusation or revelation. "Over the past several days," Dorian continued, "our investigation into threats against the crown has uncovered evidence of a conspiracy far more extensive than initially believed. Evidence that suggests certain members of the royal family have been compromised by foreign influences." Murmurs of alarm rippled through the assembled nobles and diplomats. Evangeline saw the Asturian ambassador lean forward with apparent interest, though she suspected his surprise was entirely feigned. "Furthermore," Dorian said, his voice growing stronger, "we have discovered that Queen Consort Evangeline has not been acting alone in her treasonous activities. Prince Alexander himself appears to have been corrupted by foreign gold." The accusation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Several nobles gasped audibly, while others began whispering urgently to their companions. Evangeline saw Prince Alexander's face go pale as he realized the scope of Dorian's deception. "That's a lie," Alexander said, rising from his chair with his hand moving instinctively toward his sword. "Is it?" Dorian replied, producing a set of documents from his jacket. "These financial records show regular payments from Asturian sources to accounts associated with both the Queen Consort and the Prince. Payments that coincide exactly with the transfer of classified palace security information." Evangeline realized with growing horror that Dorian wasn't just making random accusations. He had been preparing forged evidence against both her and Alexander, evidence designed to remove the 2 people most likely to inherit real power in the kingdom. "Moreover," Dorian continued, his voice taking on a tone of righteous authority, "we have reason to believe that tonight's state dinner was chosen as the venue for a planned attack against King Reginald himself, an attack that would clear the way for a puppet monarchy controlled by foreign interests." The captain gestured to several of the serving staff, who suddenly produced weapons from beneath their serving platters. But instead of pointing them at the royal family, they aimed at various nobles throughout the hall. "In the interest of protecting the crown and preserving the kingdom," Dorian announced, "I am placing both Queen Consort Evangeline and Prince Alexander under arrest for high treason, and I am assuming temporary authority over palace security until this crisis can be resolved." Evangeline felt the world spinning around her as she realized the true scope of Dorian's plan. He wasn't just trying to frame her for treason. He was staging a coup, using the appearance of a security crisis to justify seizing control of the kingdom's leadership. "This is outrageous!"
King Reginald declared, standing from his throne-like chair.
Captain Dorian, you forget yourself. I am the sovereign authority in this kingdom, and I will determine who is arrested and who is not. I'm afraid, Your Majesty, that you are not thinking clearly, Dorian replied with mock concern. The shock of discovering that your wife and son have betrayed you has clearly affected your judgment. For the good of the kingdom, I must ask you to step aside and allow proper authorities to handle this situation. Several of the armed servants moved closer to the royal table, while others positioned themselves to block the exits from the dining hall. Evangeline realized that the disguised guards she and Alexander had positioned were outnumbered by Dorian's network, and many of them might not yet realize that the captain himself was the threat. But as Dorian continued his elaborate performance, Evangeline noticed something he had overlooked. Lady Margaret had disappeared from her position near the high table, and several of the nobles who had seemed most nervous earlier were now looking confused, rather than conspiratorial. Captain Dorian, Evangeline said, rising gracefully from her chair despite the weapons pointed in her direction. Before you proceed with these serious accusations, perhaps you should explain to our distinguished guests how you obtained this remarkable evidence. The evidence speaks for itself, Dorian replied, though she noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Does it? She challenged, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Because I find it curious that you managed to uncover financial records and correspondence that supposedly prove a conspiracy involving both the prince and myself, when just days ago you claimed the evidence pointed to me acting alone. She began walking slowly around the high table, her movement drawing attention away from the positioning of the armed servants. I also find it interesting that this dramatic revelation comes just as certain irregularities in your own financial situation have begun to surface.
What irregularities?
Demanded Lord Chancellor Morrison from his position among the nobles. Evangeline smiled coldly as she produced her own set of documents, the evidence she and Margaret had gathered over the past several days. Irregularities such as regular payments from Astorian intelligence services, correspondence with known foreign agents, and most damning of all, detailed plans for tonight's operation written in Captain Dorian's own hand. The revelation sent a shock through the room as nobles and diplomats began to understand that they were witnessing not the exposure of a royal conspiracy, but the unmasking of a treasonous plot by the kingdom's own security chief.
Dorian's composure finally cracked as he realized his carefully constructed plan was unraveling.
Those documents are forgeries, he declared desperately. More evidence of the conspiracy against the crown. Are they? Prince Alexander asked, having moved to a position where he could see most of the armed servants. Then perhaps you can explain why several of your alleged co-conspirators are looking as confused as everyone else in this room. Indeed, many of the people Dorian had claimed were part of the conspiracy appeared genuinely bewildered by the evening's events. The kitchen supervisor, who had been identified as part of his network, was staring at the armed servants in obvious alarm, while Lady Catherine Blackwood's secretary had begun backing away from the conflict entirely. The truth, Captain Dorian, Evangeline said, her voice ringing with authority, is that you have been running a spy network inside this palace for years, selling our kingdom's secrets to foreign powers and manipulating our security arrangements for your own benefit.
She gestured to the documents in her hand.
When certain people began to suspect your activities, you decided to stage an elaborate deception that would remove potential threats to your operation while positioning yourself as the kingdom's savior. But you made a critical error, Prince Alexander added, drawing his sword in a fluid motion. You assumed that the evidence you planted would be accepted without question, and you underestimated the intelligence and determination of the people you were trying to frame.
The armed servants looked uncertainly between Dorian and the royal family, clearly unsure which orders to follow.
Several of them began lowering their weapons as they realized they might have been deceived about the nature of their mission. Guards of Valdoria, King Reginald declared in his most commanding voice, arrest Captain Dorian and any of his accomplices who continue to threaten the safety of our guests. The disguised guards throughout the hall revealed themselves, surrounding the confused servants and moving to secure the exits. But Dorian, realizing that his plan had completely failed, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Drawing his own sword, he lunged directly at Evangeline, apparently believing that if he could eliminate the primary threat to his deception, he might still escape with his life. But Evangeline had been preparing for this possibility. As Dorian's blade swept toward her, she dropped to the floor and rolled away, her hidden dagger appearing in her hand. Prince Alexander intercepted Dorian's second strike with his own sword, and the two men began a fierce duel in the center of the dining hall. The fight was brief but intense.
Dorian was skilled and desperate, but Alexander was younger, stronger, and fighting to protect his family rather than to save his own skin. Within minutes, the treasonous captain lay disarmed and defeated on the marble floor of the grand dining hall. As the loyal guards secured Dorian and rounded up his remaining accomplices, King Reginald helped Evangeline to her feet. The immediate danger was over, but the implications of the evening's revelations would reshape palace security for years to come. Citizens of Valdoria, the king announced to the assembled guests, "Tonight you have witnessed the exposure of a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of our kingdom. Thanks to the courage and intelligence of Queen Consort Evangeline and Prince Alexander, that threat has been eliminated." He gestured to his wife, his voice filled with pride and love. "I owe a particular debt of gratitude to my queen, who endured public accusation and personal humiliation in service to the truth. Her determination to protect this kingdom, even at great personal cost, exemplifies the very best of royal service." As the nobles and diplomats began to absorb the full scope of what they had witnessed, Evangeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 days ago, she had been barred from her husband's coronation as a suspected traitor. Tonight, she stood as one of the saviors of the kingdom, her loyalty and intelligence finally recognized by the court that had doubted her. The Asturian ambassador, looking distinctly uncomfortable as the extent of his country's espionage operations became clear, quietly departed with his diplomatic entourage. The other guests gradually returned to their interrupted dinner, though the conversation now focused entirely on the dramatic events they had just witnessed. Prince Alexander approached Evangeline as the hall began to return to some semblance of normalcy. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I owe you my life, my father's throne, and probably the independence of our entire kingdom." "You owe me nothing," Evangeline replied warmly. "We're family, Alexander. Protecting each other is what families do." For the first time since his mother's death years earlier, Prince Alexander smiled at his stepmother with genuine affection and respect. "Welcome home, Queen Evangeline," he said. "I'm sorry it took me so long to realize you belonged here." As the state dinner resumed around them, Evangeline finally felt like she had truly found her place in the royal family of Valdoria. The accusations that had nearly destroyed her had instead forged her into someone stronger, someone worthy of the crown she wore and the kingdom she had helped to save. The gate that had been closed to her just days ago was now permanently open, and she had earned her place not through birth or marriage, but through courage, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty to the realm she had chosen to call home.